right, so welcome to the folks that have already joined, some of the early birds and some of the folks that are on time. And I'm sure that we'll have some more folks join as the evening progresses. So my name is Morne Christo. For those that don't know, I'll be your host this evening, and I'm also the Dan Southern Africa CEO. First off, thank you for joining the webinar. Time's valuable, especially now that we kind of slowly getting back into, I don't know, is it the new normal or the new normal, but back into the swing of work, some of us going to the office and so forth. So thanks for making the time. I hope that you're going to find this webinar informative and also useful for your dive trips and general dive knowledge. So I trust that you guys are doing well, you're still safe and healthy, and please make sure to still wear your masks, wash your hands, and take all the COVID things into consideration. Don't get slack on that. We don't want a second wave here in South Africa and the Southern Africa regions. Talk topic this evening, medication, drugs, and diving. So there's lots that we can say about this, and I'm sure you're really going to enjoy it. Just a couple of basic housekeeping rules. You'll find that your microphones are muted as usual and your video is turned off. And that's really just the webinar setting to ensure that there's no interference during the slide presentation. Now, it'll be great if you can introduce yourself via the chat box, and if you like, you can tell us where you're from, and also let us know what some of your expectations are for the webinar. Now, if you have any questions, either now, during the webinar, or towards the end, please make use of the Q&A box and not the chat box. If you use the chat box, I might miss some of the questions, and I'd hate to do that. So, yeah, Q&A box for questions. Now, as usual, the webinar replay will be available tomorrow via all the different Dan channels, in particular YouTube and obviously Facebook. And for the folks that have registered, you'll receive a follow-up email. And for Dan members, I will then send another follow-up email so that they can also have access to the replay and all the resources that I'll share. Now, remember to stick around. As usual, we like to give away a couple of things with our lucky draw. And again, this evening, the lucky draw will be some of the Dan buffs. And this is what they look like for those that don't know. So they're nice, easy to use, and quite bright and colorful. So for the folks that have patched in via the Facebook live stream, great to have you on board. Please don't be shy to ask any questions. Use the comments for that, and I'll pass those on to Dr. Frans Cronje at the appropriate time. So yeah, let's meet Dr. Frans Cronje. For those folks that don't know him yet, he's the founder of Dan Southern Africa, the former president and CEO, a medical doctor, and he has a passion for dive medicine. So with that said, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Frans Cronje, and I hope that everybody's going to enjoy the webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Morne. I'm going to just share my screen, and you should have it in front of you now. As
yes, absolutely. I can see your slides.
Drugs
and diving.
Okay. All right. Well, it's a big topic, and it's certainly one, as Morne said, one that we'd really like your input on and your questions on. But I'm going to start off with some broad principles, and then we can zoom into details. But I think the questions of the people who were interested in this webinar is really what I'm after. Clearly, the people that are watching this have an interest in watching this. So I want to be sure that we meet your needs and answer the questions you may have, and that we don't inadvertently leave it behind. So Morne, if you can just flag, and just wave me down if there's something that pops up in the chat, on the Q&A, on Facebook, so that we address that.
Absolutely, will do.
Okay, well, on the topic on drugs and diving, the first thing we need to realize, and perhaps one of the unique things of us humans, is that we like taking stuff. I mean, we don't just eat for pleasure, we eat for its effects, or drink for its effects. It's uppers and downers. I mean, just consider your next hot beverage, whether it's caffeine or alcohol, it's in a sense a drug. And that brings me to the definition and the difference, perhaps, the distinction between a drug and medication. By way of analogy, you could, just like we have decompression illness as an umbrella term for decompression sickness and gas embolism, drug is an umbrella term that is anything you take for any reason that makes your body function differently, some of which may be medication. So drugs include anything of which medication is only one component. And so when we talk about drugs, we're not necessarily referring to bad stuff that you shouldn't be taking. It may be a synonym for medication in certain cases, but when we're talking about medication, it's specifically something that is taken for a curative or an alleviating reason. So just to get out of the way, some of the recreational drugs that people don't necessarily realize their effects on. Caffeine, for instance, a lot of people don't necessarily know, apart from the disturbance of sleep and the anxiety it can sometimes cause, it's the most common cause of extra heartbeats that we see on ECG. Whenever we do diving medicals, we see these extra heartbeats. First question is, did you have a Red Bull or coffee before you came? And the answer is almost invariably yes. And the other thing is that if you've had a lot of caffeine for a while and you stop drinking it, you can get withdrawal headaches that can be quite severe. And it's one of the reasons why grandpa medication is a bit of a death trap in a certain sense, because it's got aspirin that burns the stomach and caffeine that makes it work better, but also gives you a headache when you stop. And the only thing that alleviates it is grandpa, because it gives you the caffeine again. And so it goes on and on and on. And I've lost a couple of patients over the years just because of that particular problem. Tobacco, no need to say all the things it makes to shrink between blood vessels and bronchi, your airways. Alcohol, needless to say that it can sedate you and it can cause diuresis. Marijuana, those of you that are wondering, and now that it's been legalized, and Mona, I'm keeping my eye on you, so you just wave at me if there's a question, and I'll stop. But marijuana, we had our aerospace medicine conference last weekend, and just very, very briefly, marijuana and its breakdown products, and it's got a whole host of substances, only some of which cause psychoactive effects, but it stays in the system for at least a month. So if your urine's checked, you could have passively inhaled someone's smoke, or you could have had a joint yourself. But as far as it comes to the legalities, the important thing there is basically the word private. Private stock, private residence, private use. That's the big thing to take away with that. And also, if you are working for a company that typically has zero tolerance, then it's going to be impractical to smoke marijuana, because they can test you and you could have had the joint a month before and you'll test positive, and they won't know whether, when you took it. Having said that, those of you that do partake, if you smoked a joint, it takes 4 hours for you to get back to psychonormality, if you like. There's a study that actually has shown that it takes 4 hours. And if you eat something containing cannabis, then it takes 8 hours. So just as a rule of thumb, smoke, wait at least 4 hours, eat, wait at least 8 hours before diving, just to have it out there. Cocaine can cause a whole host of problems, of which stroke and heart attacks and severe anxiety are the ones we're most worried about. And on the flip side, we've got the opiates, codeine, morphine, heroin. Those ones, apart from the mood changes they cause, they can also cause carbon dioxide buildup and seizures, because they slow down our breathing. So that's just talking about the recreational drugs. before we get more on the medication side. So with that being said, Morna, I don't know, are there already questions? If they are, I'd be happy to field them. There might be, because recreational drugs are often a controversial subject, and there might be questions. If not, I'll carry on.
For the moment, so, no questions just yet.
No questions. So, okay, they stunned silence. Okay, so now we're talking about taking drugs underwater. And remember, with drugs, I'm meaning the umbrella term. And the two concepts I'd like to leave with you or lead you in when we think about drugs, as we think about diving and managing inert gas, in fact, because remember, the way we think about inert gas is actually exactly the same way we think about drugs, because there's absorption, there's distribution, metabolism, not so much if it's an inert gas, but with medication, there's metabolism, and elimination, which is usually either stool or urine if it's a drug, and breathing out if it's a gas. So that we call pharmacokinetics, and kinetic is movement. So you can think about or remember that as that's the movement of medication or something we take or breathe that's foreign to our bodies, at least or dosage-wise, and there's absorption, distribution, metabolism, and elimination. On the flip side, we've got the dynamics. That's what the stuff does, and it has side effects. All drugs only have side effects. Now, that might sound like a shock, but the reality is we choose drugs for the side effects we like, and we call those the effects. And the ones we don't like, we then call side effects. But in reality, all drugs only have side effects. Okay, so maybe that's a sobering way to think about it, but it's a sober way to think about it. The effects are the side effects we like. And then we have the interactions that drugs have, not only between different drugs, but with the diving environment, and of course, the effects of, for instance, nitrogen narcosis and elevated PO2. And then there's always the issue of allergies, and that's why you should never take any medication for the first time when you go diving. You should have a track record with it before you take it underwater. So that's a very, very important thing to know. Just to liven things up a bit, can anybody think that's listening in, can anybody think about how absorption, and remember, there are many ways in which we can take drugs. We can drink them, they can be injected, they can be a patch that we have on the skin. Is there any, inhaled, is there any way that you think the absorption might be altered as a result of diving? Just flip a coin in the air, quick draw. Anybody got an answer to that?
So I'll encourage folks to, maybe for now, there should be a thing where you can give a thumbs up. Okay, here we go. We got one high pressure.
Yes.
Okay.
And high pressure, in what way?
Okay, well, we'll wait for Mr. Govender just to give us some feedback on that.
Well, while you're thinking, the obvious thing is the pressure and the nitrogen and so on. But one of the things that we don't always think about is that a lot of medications are becoming very popular as a plaster that you stick on the skin.
Yeah.
And they're waterproof, so they stay there. But the difficulty is twofold. One is you either get that the physical pressure as a result of being underwater introduces a greater quantity of the drug into your system, or particularly if the water's cold, the skin actually has vasoconstriction and you have less absorption of the drug than you would expect. So both of those are things that affect absorption. Okay, so I don't know whether there were alternative answers or thoughts on that in the chat. See something ping there.
Essentially, you addressed and the answer that was given, faster absorption due to higher pressure. Also, narcosis is a sort of natural effect without even taking drugs. That might be drug-like, you know. So that's great feedback.
And distribution. Well, distribution. I mean, our circulatory system is altered. 30% more blood is in the central pool of circulation. So the way drugs move around the body is completely different. Metabolism, a lot of drugs are activated or inactivated by oxygen. And so if we breathe elevated PO2s, they may either be more active or less active as a result of that. And then lastly, elimination. I mean, we all know about diuresis when we go diving. So we can eliminate drugs more rapidly in certain situations. So you already have the ideas there. And then on the pharmacodynamic side, the effects or the side effects can be additive. So if they're sedating, nitrogen narcosis can make it worse. If they're agitating, well, oxygen toxicity can make it worse in the form of seizures. So those are sort of the thoughts that I'd like to encourage you just to have in the back of your mind when you're thinking about something that nowadays often we don't even think about. You just take your daily medication. You don't think about that, particularly if you go diving. So let me just take a step back and introduce how this whole topic really became part of the conversation of diving. In 1979, there was a workshop, and the workshop actually had nothing to do about recreational diving at all. It had to do with people who were in saturation situations. In other words, they were spending weeks underwater, either in habitats or in deep saturation diving. And they were just discussing, well, what will be the effect of resuscitating someone with epinephrine or adrenaline if they had a heart attack or something like that. So that was the discussion. But that discussion sparked a second discussion, which was, well, okay, now we're talking about medications. What about just regular diving? And that's really where the conversation started. And unfortunately, if you look at the US Navy manual today, what you'll find are things like there are no hard and fast rules. Generally, topical medications and antibiotics are okay. Birth control medication, usually okay. Decongestants, they're variable. We don't like things that make you drowsy, but hey, you need to ask the dive doctor. And in our case, we'd like you to call Dan. But you know what? We don't necessarily know, because new drugs are coming on the market every day. They have different side effects, and we need to keep up with that. And if you don't ask the question, we don't get the opportunity to develop the answer. So you're doing us a favor by asking the question, and we'd like to encourage you to do that. A great place, though, if you want to, oh, I see your hand there, Morne. Was there a question?
Yeah, well, not a question, but maybe just something that I heard one of the dive doctors in the past say, Dr. Rob Schneider, said that relates to what you've said. Yeah, with all the new drugs that are coming out and even some of the older ones, as it relates to scuba diving, to know the effects, you need proper studies done on them, and there aren't always funds available to do that. And that's basically because the sport, I guess, is small compared to all the other activities in the world that are required to do certain studies. And quite often we align scuba diving with aviation medicine. So is there...
Boom. Morning. They'll think that we in cahoots about this presentation, but you're absolutely right. In aviation, because of the psychomotor effects and the disastrous effects that those would have on the competency of crews, many studies have been done on drugs in the aviation setting, as you were saying, and that's a great place to look. So if you want to look for reputable information, and there's a lot on the internet, using the words such as PubMed or Google Scholar, using those as your search engine terms, if you like, or tools, usually gets you to articles that are more reputable than somebody who's tooting his own horn or promoting, some particular drug that they may want to be selling. So PubMed and Google Scholar usually have great and review. Review is also a very, very good search term, because that gives you a bird's eye view on a medication, rather than maybe a couple of rats that they poisoned with them. Forgive me, those of you that love the furry animals. I know we don't like experimentation on animals, but if you consider the alternatives to do it on humans, that's sometimes quite completely unethical and impossible. So sometimes we need to do that. But the important thing is to get a proper overview of how it actually impacts us. And those are the things you're looking for. So PubMed, Google Scholar, and review. Those are three terms that really get you some of the best information most quickly and get you to the right address. Okay, so having said that, what now? What do we do with this whole big topic of drugs and diving? Well, we're going to start with some general guidelines. And the general guidelines are really, first of all, that we're dealing with three distinct things that overlap. The drug or the medication is only one of them. There's the reason why you're taking it, which usually is the more important thing. The disease or the illness, disorder, call it what you will. There's a reason why you're taking it. And that may be more important. If you're taking vitamin supplements because you've got epilepsy, I'm not concerned about the vitamin supplements, but I am concerned about the epilepsy. Okay. So, just to use an extreme example. And then there's the diving that you're doing. If you've got diabetes and you're doing diving in caves where you can't get back to the surface, if you run into trouble with low blood sugar, that's a disaster. So there's the interaction with diving that you need to consider. It's not so much necessarily the disease or the drug. Those may be managed, but if the diving isn't chosen selectively, it could be a disaster. So we need to think about that. We need to think about the interactions between each of these, how the drug affects diving, diving affects the drug. For instance, they may be more sedating, or they may be eliminated more quickly. Diving in the disease and diving. Well, diving, if you lose consciousness, kills you, you'll drown. Or if it's something that involves equalization, then the disease or the condition may actually be worsened by diving. And then there's the drug-disease interaction, where the drugs may be more potent. There are certain drugs, if you take them in a high oxygen environment, they become toxic. And so we need to consider that. And equally, a disease may actually have an influence on the drug because of the diving environment. So we need to put all of those things together and then make a decision as to whether it's worth it and or how we can do risk management. So if I can break it down, there's 7 questions for risk assessment: the drug, the disease or disorder, and the diving you plan to do. Then the interaction between each of those, and then finally the overall diving safety. So you can take any drug, any medication, and you can ask those 7 questions, and then you will have a fair idea, or at least have thought through the potential problems that you're likely to come across, or at least be able to ask the right questions if you don't have the answers readily available. Okay, so let's start with looking at the so-called bad drugs. And again, Mona, I'm keeping you my peripheral vision there, so if you wave your hand, I hold the bus and take a question. So
there are 2 questions, but I think let's first get through this section and then we can address those.
Okay, good. Thanks for pacing me. The bad drugs, I think you already intuitively know, would be the ones that affect your brain and affect your ability to exercise. If you're not awake, it's, underwater is not the best place to be. So we want to be alert and conscious. we want to have all our faculties, and we want to be able to exercise if necessary, especially in an emergency. And so drugs that interfere with that ability will invariably be ones we have natural concerns about. So bear that in mind in terms of just generically thinking about drugs. Diseases were clearly the ones, again, that affect our consciousness, alertness, ability to concentrate, and again, the ones that allow us to exercise and or to equalize. If you've got middle ear problems, sinus problems, those are issues that would constitute a so-called bad disease. And you can go through the body from crown to toe, and there might be potential illnesses, diseases, disorders that could represent a problem of diving. And when I say bad dives, it's not that they're bad, but it's that they impose additional burdens or strains on the body. And so we're looking at those involving a lot of exertion or exercise, exposures to heat or cold, elaborate equipment, which you need to keep track of and haul up and down staircases or set up in advance, extremes of depth, duration, stops, and distance. You know, those are the things that if you've got a medical condition that is unstable, you don't want to be in a situation where you're now in a crisis because of the environment you chose to dive in. If you've got a bad back, alloy boat launches are not the best place to be, simply because, you know, you need to think that way. So it might be fine for you to do a calm weather dive somewhere, but you don't want to do a shore entry and you don't want to do a rough boat entry. So we need to think about those things when we get into that. But before I get into the specific drugs, Mornay, we can maybe get to those questions. And you also wanted to mention you had some advertorials, I think, at this point in the talk. So over to you.
Well, first of all, just like to say it's great to see that diving activities in a lot of the countries throughout the Dan Southern Africa region has picked up. You know, it's not quite where it should be. Obviously, with a lot of the restrictions that have been imposed on the European countries, that's been a bit of a down. Obviously, international travel is not where we'd like it to be just yet, but definitely local travel, and especially I can see in South Africa, has picked up significantly. And it's really great to see how the clubs and the different dive operators and businesses are really working together to promote local diving and again expose people to the wonders of the coastline and all the great dives and dive sites that we have. And with that, obviously, I can see how the Dan hotline or dive emergency hotline activities have picked up. And for that, I'd really like to say thank you to all the divers that are engaging with that service that we have. It really is the heartbeat of Dan. And for those that don't know, it's not just for emergencies. It's obviously there to ask questions either via email or give us a call. And what's great is we have a range of diving doctors that are on call, and they will answer these questions. And obviously we have the dive medics that can then field all the questions and just sort of manage the administrative side of things. So please make use of that. Earlier, I also mentioned the travel notification. You can find that on our website or inquire. I'll also add it into the follow-up emails. Please make use of that. Even if you're traveling locally, it helps us gather all the necessary information prior to your dive trip, along with where you're going, who's diving with you, the kind of dives you'll be doing, how regularly you dive, some of the medication and health concerns that you might have. And that all helps us to provide some additional advice prior to your trip for you to consider if you haven't already. And so thanks for that. And obviously we can see a lot more people are joining and renewing again. And interesting enough, quite a lot of professional divers, so scientific divers, photographic, and then a lot of commercial divers have started joining as certain things have come up. So I'd just like to use this time, say thanks for that. And for those folks that are thinking about the upcoming Christmas and festive season, we've got a bunch of great Black Friday deals that'll be exposed or marketed to you in the next week or two. So some great deals that you can have a look at from Black Friday all the way through to Cyber Monday. So I'll leave it at that now and hand over back to Dr. Frans Cronje. Thank you for your time.
Okay, thanks for that, Mornay. Yeah, that's it's really encouraging, as I say, with the aerospace conference we had. We can see obviously how aviation has taken a nosedive for quite a while, but that it's gradually picking up, and that's so encouraging to see. So part of that would include diving. And Mornay, you raised your hand again there. Was there a question?
Yeah, we've got a couple of questions, and I don't know if this is sort of a natural break. Would you like to field those?
Yeah, why not? Go for it.
All right, so I'll start with Tom Cross. He asked the question, being aware of divers' HIV status is one thing, but where do antiretroviral fit into this, the bigger scheme of things, I guess? So, okay, well, I know my buddy might have this condition. How do we sort of deal with this from a medication point of view?
Okay, well, that's a great question. And the infectivity of HIV is much lower than hepatitis B, for instance. And all of those are managed with the cleaning agents that are already propagated. And they are equally effective for the coronavirus, for that matter. So, you know, as far as that goes, and the infectivity goes, HIV is really not the one that one would be worried about. As far as the antiretrovirals are concerned, one would not want to start a new regimen and go diving prior to stabilization. And there are some of the drugs that do seem to have some mitochondrial effects, and their lethargy, et cetera, may have a role to play. And then one of the biggest concerns, certainly in aviation, has been that HIV is associated with cognitive issues. So the ability to concentrate and cognitive decline. And that sometimes is a very insidious, a very difficult thing to deal with, but something that one needs to know about. But the drugs themselves are usually not the main problem. But great question. I hope I've answered it, even though it was a very broad stroke sort of answer.
So what I'll also do, Tom, and for the rest that are on the webinar, we do have a HIV and diving article, and I'll add that as you know, to the follow-up email. And if you have any questions, you can obviously ask some more after that. I do have another question via Facebook. It's from Jacques Vieira in Madagascar. He says tobacco gum, not a good idea under water or under pressure. That wasn't a good idea. He said, why is this, he wants to know, and has there been any studies done on this? So I think I already know what the answer is, but I'll allow you to answer, Dr. Cronje.
Well, I think there's a mechanical aspect. You know, one of the things, or one of the pieces of advice we tend to give divers that tend to get seasick underwater is that they shouldn't eat anything that won't easily go through the exhaust port. I know that sounds a little bit macabre, but you know, green apples is one of the things you can take that actually are somewhat antiemetic, and if you are unfortunate enough to vomit underwater, at least it won't block up the mechanism of your DV. Chewing tobacco might have a similar effect in that it may block the mechanism of the DV. So, you know, that's one thing to bear in mind. As far as the absorption goes, that's not really as much a consideration, although nicotine is a vasoconstrictor, and we're not necessarily sure of what effects it would have on top of all the other effects and some of the stimulating effects it might even have. As far as I know, no studies have been done, but I would say purely from a mechanical point of view, it's probably not the best idea.
Yeah. All right, Jock.
Any other questions?
I hope that answers the question. Last question before we continue. It's from Sumari van Staden. She says, when I'm on a dive boat for a week or go diving, I guess, my sinuses get all bunged up from the air conditioning while sleeping. So I guess in the bungalow or, you know, the chalet or whatever. She says, I take a 12-hour Sudafed in the morning. I also take Prexis Plus. What are your thoughts on that? Sometimes for 2 or 3 weeks at a time with a 2-day break in between weeks. I don't know if you got all of that, Dr. Cronje.
Okay. Well, I'll try and address that. We'll talk about Sudafed specifically. One of the concerns about Sudafed or any decongestant is that if it's taken over a prolonged period of time, you actually get a reverse or rebound congestion. So it actually makes it worse. After about 5, 6, 7 days, you can actually get engorgement or congestion in a paradoxical way. So it makes the sinusitis worse. So that's something to bear in mind. And another thing, a tip that I've experimented with and really been very, very surprised about is a product called colostrum. Solgar or Solol, familiar brands make it. What it is the first milk a cow produces is actually not milk. It's a liquid that is meant to set up the calf's whole gastrointestinal tract. So it's an ecosystem, if you like. And it you get them in capsules. They're easy to just break open the capsule and let the powder stay around in the mouth. And what that does, and the benefit that has to, for example, probiotics, is that you're already taking some antibodies. There's some antibodies that are in the colostrum that actually bind not only some potential pathogens, but even some potential allergens. And we found that people that have sinus issues or particularly have these problems with air conditioning find that colostrum actually works extremely well if they take it twice a day, and it lasts you quite a while. If you take it while you travel, and if you take it when at a diving destination or maybe on a liveaboard, to take it during that time to boost your immunity, to keep your gut health optimal, to help your sinuses along, and not to get into the cycle of rebound congestion. And then on the topic of Sudafed or pseudoephedrine, it's a controlled substance in many countries, and you need a prescription if you want to buy pure Sudafed, although in combination with analgesics, you can, and I'll show you just now, you can get it over the counter, which is a bit odd, but that's the nature of things. So I hope I've answered your question to some extent. If not, please feel free to post subsequent emails, and I hope to expand on the answer. Was there anything else, Mornay?
No, not at all. And again, just to add to what you've said, we've got some great articles on medication diving, one of which you wrote a couple of years ago, plus Dr. Celia Roberts, and I'll share those in the notes with the follow-up emails. So no more questions for the moment. We can continue. Okay.
Well, I'm going to talk about a couple of drugs just because they open up the thinking process about how drugs and diving could work together or not work together. And I've chosen those because they are common and in common use and have definite impact. And just to make the slides easier to read, I've used these icons. The smiley means how effective they are. The dynamite means the side effects. the skull and crossbones means possible dangers, and the droplet means the dosage that would typically be prescribed. So just so you know what you're looking at in the slides to follow. And I'm going to kick off with pseudoephedrine, seeing that was the one that there was an interest in. And without a doubt, it is the single most effective medication when it comes to decongesting the eustachian tubes. The problem is it's a scheduled drug, and it can wear off if you take it more than it works for about 4 hours. So if you take it too late, it can be a problem. You certainly don't want to take it for the first time when you go diving. And there are the potential side effects of anxiety, palpitations, and we've even had males taking 3 or more tablets of pseudoephedrine, and they get complete urinary retention. In other words, they are unable to empty their bladders, and they had to be medevaced, to be catheterized to actually get their bladders decompressed. So it's not something to mess with. It's not a matter of if one works, then 2 works better. Sometimes that will get you into trouble and into toxic situations. In general, pseudoephedrine doesn't seem to have significant side effects. A lot of divers have used it, but it's no longer readily available. And that, I think, is the biggest issue. And in many countries, it may not necessarily even be allowed without a prescription. So be careful not to get into trouble. If you do decide to take it, never take more than 60 milligrams about a half an hour before diving. And in reality, the only way that you would easily get access to it is if you get it in combination with an analgesic. And the one that is probably the safest to take would be the one that you can see marked here, pseudoephedrine with paracetamol, because all the others have other potential side effects. Ibuprofen, there's some concerns even with COVID that ibuprofen has some interactions with it that may not necessarily be helpful. Codeine, there's some countries where they'll actually institute a long jail sentence or even a death sentence if you take them there. So be very, very wary about traveling with anything containing codeine. So that's my take on that. What I would add, maybe just as a disclaimer when it comes to pseudoephedrine, I would not recommend pseudoephedrine for someone who can't equalize without it. In other words, if you can't equalize without taking pseudoephedrine, you need to find another solution. You need to see an ENT or come to see a diving doctor to see if we can't find a better way. Never take it for the first time underwater. You need to have a track record and a safety record before taking it underwater. And never take more than twice 60 milligrams in a day, and never take it for more than 5 days continuously. And if you have issues with anxiety or cardiovascular issues or prostate issues, it's not a good idea to take it. And if you are going to be breathing high PO2s, just be wary that pseudoephedrine might, it's not been proven, but might actually lower the threshold for oxygen toxicity. Where would I consider using it? Really only 2 situations, and that is where people have problems with one ear. And that might be on the way down, but it may also be on the way up. In other words, when a person's ascending and they actually have an episode of vertigo due to alternobaric vertigo, where the pressure in the one middle ear is different to the other, and that is alleviated to a large extent with pseudoephedrine. So that would be one situation where I might consider it. And the other would be if someone has had a bad case of middle ear barrett trauma and they're very nervous about diving again, I might tell them, well, why don't you try Sudafed and go and exercise in the pool and just get your confidence back and make sure you can equalize. And that has been very, very helpful in getting divers over that hump of just getting back into diving, not taking Sudafed after that on subsequent dives, but just to try it in the pool, get the confidence back, and get equalizing again. Okay. Any questions, Mornay, on Pseudophed? We still good to go?
Yes,
okay.
Still good to go.
Oxymetazoline comes in different names and brands. In South Africa, the best value for money is Drixine with the squeezy bottle, not the dropper bottle, the squeezy bottle. In the States, it's Afrin. It is related to adrenaline. And unfortunately, in most of the studies, it doesn't seem to be much better than a placebo, which essentially means something you believe in that may or may not actually work. However, having said that, if you do take Drixine or use Afrin, and you take it with the head lying backwards so that the drops actually roll down through the nose, close to the openings of the eustachian tubes, they seem to be helpful, or on your knees with your head down with the drops in there to open the sinus passages. It actually seems to work quite well. So I haven't written off oxymetazoline as a potential drug that might work. Now I want to get into a topic where the drugs are really secondary, and that is the whole issue with motion sickness. I like to think of, or I divide motion sickness into 4 categories. The people we have a sort of a envy for, with the ones that never get seasick, well, they obviously don't need to take anything. Then there are those that sometimes get a bit nauseous on the boat, or on the dive boat, or on a liverboard. And for those, Pseudoephedrine or Cenarizine is one of the least sedating antihistamine-like or calcium channel blocker-like substances, and low dosages actually work better than high ones. So you don't have to take Pseudoephedrine forte. You can take the regular Pseudoephedrine, and that works pretty well. And you can take it 3 times a day. And by the way, those of you that like sushi, not sure that you do it at the moment, the way things are in the world with the pandemic, but the ginger that you get with the pickled ginger that you get with sushi actually is an antiemetic. It actually helps and is seemingly almost as good as Pseudoephedrine. So that's something to think about. So that's Cenarizine. Then there are the antihistamines, and dimenhydramine has probably been the sort of the go-to travel antihistamine. The problem with it is it's quite sedating. Now, the US Navy have said if you've tried it and you aren't zonked out after taking it, it's reasonable to take it up to 30 meters. I'm not really wild about that idea, but if you've used it and you can use it safely, there is literature that supports you using that. I'm not really wild about it. If you're on a liverboard, and it can really be miserable if you're on a liverboard and you're seasick and you're going to be there for a couple of days, the scopolamine patch, if you can still get it, because they're becoming harder and harder to find, give you essentially 3 days cover. The one downside, or actually 2 downsides with a patch, is that the patch itself can cause hallucinations. So you can sort of see pink elephants underwater, which is not a good idea. And the other thing is that they can cause the pupils of the eye to dilate, which means that you get blurry vision, and it can sometimes look or resemble a medical emergency. So if you've handled the scopolamine patch, which is usually put behind the ear, make sure you wash your hands very well and don't rub your eyes, and switch from side to side every 3 days while you are on the dive trip. But the one that I would, or the 2 that I really want to point out are firstly for the people who aren't only sick on the boat and in the water, but are even sick afterwards. When they get off the boat, they actually still feel a bit wobbly, or may actually be nauseous for the remainder of the day. There's a medication that is traditionally used to treat epilepsy, But in the studies that were done on space sickness, in other words, on astronauts, they found that phenytoin, or Phenytoin as it's also known, is actually an extremely effective antiemetic. And 5 milligrams per kilogram, if you take it in divided doses, in other words, if you take, let's say, 300 milligrams, let's say you weigh 100, let's say you weigh about 70 kilograms, so you take 300 milligrams, you can take it 150 milligrams twice a day, and it seems to be safe for at least up to 2 weeks. And people who get really, really seasick seem to have the greatest benefit. And in fact, one of the people I saw today for a diving medical uses that when they go diving, and they find it's very useful for them. The other one, which is really the unsung hero, which people who are in the yachting industry know about, is promethazine or Phenergan. Now, Phenergan is probably one of the strongest antiemetic or anti-motion sickness drugs there are. The downside being it's very sedating. But if you take it the night before, the next morning, firstly, you sleep a little bit better because it's sedating. Secondly, the next day, you still have the antiemetic effect. So you still have the motion sickness protection, but without the sedation. And there are a lot of people who do transatlantic cruises, and they take promethazine every day, bearing in mind if they need to take night watch sessions, you don't take it then. But it's something that a lot of yachties know about. And I've prescribed very successfully to people who have taken long yacht voyages, and it works equally well for diving. So this I typically would prescribe for people that sometimes get nauseous on the boat, but especially for those that tend to vomit underwater, which is very hazardous. You know, even if it's something that's relatively easy to get through the exhaust port, it's not a good thing to vomit underwater. I heard a ping there. Is there something I need to pay attention to, Mornay? No questions? Okay, good. All right, now another big topic, malaria. And the controversy surrounding Lariam or mefloquine. Now, here's the thing with mefloquine. If you take mefloquine, you can have side effects that look like being psychotic or having neurological side effects for a period of 4 weeks. So you take one tablet, and for the next 4 weeks, you have psychiatric disturbances, and you have bad dreams or weird sort of psychedelic dreams. So from a prescriber's point of view, from a doctor's point of view, we don't like to prescribe Lariam, even though it's very effective. Secondly, if you take it and the first dose didn't cause problems, you'll only know after taking it 4 times, in other words, over 4 weeks, whether it will have some negative side effects. So one tablet can give you 4 weeks of problems, and you only know after 4 weeks whether you won't have problems taking it. Now, why am I saying all of this? Because we've had people that have already been on Lariam for a while that then ask, can they go diving? And the answer is, if you've already been on Lariam for 8 weeks without psychiatric side effects, then there's no reason to stop it at that stage. Would I prescribe it? No. Would I stop it if you've been diving for 8 weeks without problems? No, because then you've already proven that it doesn't seem to be bad for you. Do we recommend it? No, we don't. What do we recommend? In an unselected group of people. In other words, you don't have a chance to really fine-tune people that may have side effects to some of the drugs, with doxycycline, which is coming up next, being one of our go-to drugs. Then the combination of atovaquone, proguanil, sold as either Malarone or Malanol, is the one that we would would recommend, it has the advantage that you only need to take it for a week after you return away from the malaria area. The downside being it's relatively expensive. So that's one of the reasons why it's not that popular in South Africa, but very popular in Europe and the United States, where the cost is relatively insignificant, and it certainly works very well. Here's doxycycline. This is the one that Dan Southern Africa sort of puts forward as the go-to drug. It's fairly effective, and remember, none of the chemoprophylactics against malaria are 100% effective, but it makes your skin more sensitive to the sun, so you need to use sun protection factor 30 to 60. You shouldn't take it with things, with food containing calcium, so milk, for instance. You don't drink it at the same time. And if you take it at night, you're less likely to have some gastrointestinal side effects. So that's the way we recommend you take doxycycline, with the recommendation that you should take it for a month after you've returned. Now, we know that most people, once they're home, they stop taking the drugs. Who wants to take drugs if you feel you don't need to? Well, if that is your attitude, and there is a case for it, then you must be absolutely paranoid for any flu-like symptoms. And remember, now we've got COVID as another potential confounding factor that might be something that could cause similar symptoms. But if you have symptoms after returning from a malaria area, you should always think malaria. And just because we now have COVID to deal with doesn't mean malaria has become any less prevalent. So we need to remain very, very vigilant when it comes to malaria. Ciprofloxacin in general is fairly good if you get urinary tract infections. It's good for a number of infections of the external ear, like swimmer's ear. So it's sort of the go-to drug for swimmer's ear. And although we don't like people diving with swimmer's ear, it's a humid environment usually that it starts in. And for that reason, we usually fairly quick to start with antibiotics, realizing that people might get a very serious form of swimmer's ear if you don't start antibiotics quite quickly. We would not start antibiotics that quickly if it, if someone gets it with frequent hair washers disease, as we might call it, in sort of domestic environments. Okay, mefloquine I've spoken about. Let me just move on here. Loperamide, Imodium. We all know that when we travel, there's the risk of traveler's diarrhea. Importantly, we need to distinguish between diarrhea and dysentery. What's the difference? Dysentery means diarrhea with blood in the stool. If you have dysentery, the last thing you want to do is to stop the spontaneous elimination of organisms. So you don't want to take Imodium if you've got blood in the stool. Secondly, if you've got the trots, if you've got diarrhea, you're dehydrated and therefore at greater risk for decompression illness. But if you've got a fairly mild case, Imodium does not seem to pose a significant concern with diving, as long as you don't take more than 6 tablets in a day. Okay, so that's as far as loperamide. Doxycycline we've covered, going in this direction. And the last 2 drugs that I'm going to just point out specifically are those that are good and those that are least preferred when it comes to antihypertensives. In, I would say, the past 50 years, the go-to drug or drugs for hypertension were diuretics. That changed dramatically 5 years ago And from then on forward, angiotensin enzyme, converting enzyme blockers or inhibitors, or a slightly more sophisticated version of the same thing, angiotensin receptor blockers, became the first choice. Now, why am I singling it out? Because if someone's got hypertension, and it's quite common, about 7% of a population above 35 years are on antihypertensives. So it's a large number of people that are on this. But the ACE inhibitors can quite commonly, more than we realize, about 15 to 20% of cases, cause coughing. And I say to my own shame that at one stage I was taking an ACE inhibitor and I had a cough, which I didn't notice, and my wife pointed it out to me. And that's when I realized that the cough was caused by the ACE inhibitor. I switched to an angiotensin receptor blocker, no more coughing. I've had people come to me and I've identified it with them. People who thought they had asthma and it was an ACE inhibitor. So just realize that now there are a lot of generics, and the angiotensin receptor blockers are, I would say, becoming almost the first choice because they don't have that side effect. So just be aware of that. And then in terms of the drugs we really try and stay away from when it comes to blood pressure are the beta blockers. Why? Well, the beta blockers, just to give you an idea, they're alpha blockers and they're beta blockers. The alpha blockers have to do with the narrowing of blood vessels. The beta blockers have to do with the strength of your heartbeat. And a beta blocker, therefore, tends to lower your capacity for exercise. And the unselected or the non-selected beta blockers, like Inderal, propranolol, is the worst. So it would inhibit your ability to exercise, and that's the last thing you want when you go diving. So if you're going to a doctor, you have hypertension, I would suggest you recommend that if they're going to put you on something, start with an angiotensin receptor blocker, an ARB, and try and make sure that you don't go on a beta blocker as a first choice. There's a place for them, and there are certain situations where they may be used, but in general, they are drugs that we tend to avoid. Okay, so that's an overview on the most common medicines. And I think at this point, I'd like to open the floor and just get a feel for some of the questions people may have about drugs and diving in general.
So, Dr. Cronje, thank you very much. Great stuff. I do have a handful of questions via Facebook as well as Zoom. So I'll start with the Facebook ones. And I think some of them you've answered. But the first one, let me just find it here. It's from Gordon Yule down Shelley Beach side, or roughly that area. It says, how would diving before chemo affect treatment?
Diving before chemo. Okay. Well, before chemo already presumes the person has a malignancy. And the malignancy is one of the first things that you would consider. I mean, if it's a brain tumor, you would have concerns about seizures. Let me think what else. If you have let me think of another example that would fit the bill. If you have colon cancer, that may also cause obstructions because it interferes with the movement of gas and stool. So the malignancy is an issue. Will diving aggravate the malignancies as such? There's not very strong evidence that it would. In fact, there was a long period of time where hyperbaric oxygen was used together with radiotherapy to treat cancer. So there isn't really very strong evidence that diving would aggravate generic malignancies, but it depends very much on what type of malignancy it is. Just on the topic of chemotherapy, there are three chemotherapy agents that I'd like to single out. The worst is bleomycin, which is often used with testes cancer and some other solid tumors. That actually can cause severe pulmonary fibrosis, especially if you expose it to elevated oxygen. So that's something that you don't want to be diving on. I know you said before chemo, but I'm mentioning it anyway. The other one is doxorubicin or adriamycin, often used with breast cancer, that actually can weaken the heart to the point of causing cardiac failure. And there are people that have needed heart transplants because they had high doses of oxygen, not diving, but high doses of oxygen together with adriamycin. And then there's cisplatin and its derivatives that actually can cause ulcerations. And those ulcerations get worse in the presence of oxygen. So as a generic, it depends very much on the cancer. And as far as chemotherapy is concerned, it depends on what the chemotherapy is. Most chemotherapies are actually potentiated to some extent by additional oxygen. Okay, I've answered that question.
All right. Well, thank you for that. I do have another 2 or 3 questions via Facebook before we move on to Zoom. Gideon, that's listening via Facebook, I have asked him to just get in touch with us via the hotline or supply us some contact details, mainly because his question doesn't really relate to this topic, and it has to do with skin rashes and things like that. So Gideon, I'm not skipping you. I see you've just sent me your details. I'll put you in touch with the Dan Medics, and they will put you in touch with one of the dive doctors. All right, so Jacques Vieira from Madagascar, but this time it's Sandra, his wife. And I think you've answered the question, just going through the question. She wants to know, I would like to know what the effects are of the anti-malaria drugs, especially Malarone. So Sandra, I think most of those questions have been answered, but if you do have any more, please get in touch with me. You know how to do it, and I'll put you in touch with who needs to provide you with answers. But once again, I will make a note to add the malaria and diving article that, in fact, Dr. Cronje, Hadmi Brits, and Albie de Frey, I think years back, put together, but you sort of took the lead on that. And that's a great article with references and things. And in fact, there's some nice YouTube lectures and things on that I can also share. Just to answer.
Morning, can I jump in there?
Yeah.
The one thing about Malarone, Malanol is it does seem to increase the risk of seasickness. So that's the only side effect that I'm aware of. And whether that's truly a side effect of Malarone, Malanol, don't know. But there've been reports that people have been a bit more vulnerable to seasickness. So I maybe just want to add that. Other than that, no problems.
All right. Yeah, and then for Gordon, Dr. Morris, a couple of years back, wrote a nice article on cancer and diving. So I'll also add that to the useful links. Hopefully you'll find some more information in there. We've got Robert Cronje. I've met him a couple of years ago when I was in the States at the Dan America office. Nice to have you on all the way from the US. So he's is more, again, a little bit on the diving and fitness side, but he says UHMS RSTC recently changed the standard from 13 METs to 6 METs. What do you feel is a suitable minimal benchmark when determining someone's fitness to dive? And if a beta blocker can meet the minimum of 6 METs, should they dive? So there's a lot of questions in there. That's quite a great question, I must say.
That's a great question. Let's start with the historic background where 13 METs came from. 13 METs came from Alfred Bouvet, a cardiologist's recommendation to the experimental Navy diving unit, and the minimal fitness, which was considered to be the ability to swim against a 2-knot current. And that's 13 METs. So that's where the 13 METs, the sort of magical value, came from. It also happens to be the energy output at stage 5 of a familiar protocol or a staged protocol of stress ECG testing. So if you go to stage 5 on a Bruce protocol, which is the protocol, there are many modifications. If you go to stage 5, then it's 13 METs. So in other words, you've gone all the way on a stress, and you've got enough fitness to deal with, let's call it a reasonable emergency. So that's where 13 METs came from. Now, the reality is that that type of energy expenditure is unlikely. And if you held that bar to most scuba divers out there today, you'd probably have a quarter of the scuba divers of the world left because there are not that many people that are that fit. So I'm not being cynical, but I'm being realistic. If you want to test an individual where you have concerns that their fitness is impaired with a beta blocker, which was part of your question, then trying to get them in a stress test as close as possible to 13 METs at least gives you the assurance that they are fairly exercise tolerant in spite of the beta blocker. So in that case, well, wow, if you get 13 METs on a beta blocker, the beta blocker isn't really blocking much. So that's a good thing. Yeah. But the reality is that the level of energy expenditure is probably closer to 7 to 9 METs. And that's why the RSCC has come down, because the reality is the amount of energy expenditure, even in somewhat of an emergency, is unlikely to exceed that if you can maintain it for at least 5 minutes. Because that's the other thing. People can do a spurt of energy expenditure, but they can't keep it up for very long. So it's 7 to 9 METs for at least 5 minutes. That would be the fitness metric that one would aim for. I hope that's answered your question.
Yeah, no, great question and great answer. All right, that wraps up the Facebook questions. Let's get on to the Zoom questions. So Gerrit Jan van Velze, not so much a question, but maybe a little bit of a hidden question within the statement I think he makes. He said, I agree with your indications for pseudoephedrine. People abuse this good drug. Excellent for treatment of ultrabaric vertigo. Would you like to add anything to that, or do you just agree with that, Dr. Cronje?
Well, that was the example I used where I would consider using it. Yeah, because the risk of the pseudoephedrine versus the risk of having vertigo underwater, favors rather taking pseudoephedrine. So that's really the toss-up. Yeah. The alternobaric vertigo could get a person in a significant unplanned breath hold ascent, which could be lethal, whereas the chances that pseudoephedrine, especially if it's a low dose, would cause a person, especially on a shallow dive, problems is fairly marginal.
Yeah. All right. Well, we also have a great article on the ultrabaric vertigo written by Dr. Celia Roberts, who, by the way, is also on the call or the Zoom meeting this evening. So welcome. Nice to have you on board. Another question from Gerrit Jan van Velze. Hopefully I can pronounce the drug he mentions correctly, but he says, what about azithromycin for malaria prophylaxis? I can spell it just in case. azithromycin. Not sure about that one. Well, what I can do is always put it in the email, and we can sort of get to that one.
Yeah, I don't know. The coartem or the treatment of malaria versus the prophylaxis of malaria are two different topics. So if you already have malaria, diving really should be the lowest priority. And using a treatment drug as a prophylactic drug would be inappropriate. So I don't know whether what you were referring to is a trade name of Coartem or Phenytoin, which is sort of the Chinese wonder drug. The bigger issue would be why you're taking it. If you're taking it for treatment, you shouldn't be diving, and to take it as a prophylactic is inappropriate. So I don't know whether that helps, but please do post an email, and we'll just research and make sure that we've given you the right answer on that particular drug, because I think it's a trade name that you gave rather than the active ingredient.
Yes, please, Gerrit, that would be great. You'll also find in the follow-up email, there's an email you can use, or just reply to the email, and we'll pass it on either to Dr. Cronje or any of the other dive doctors, and they can assist with that. Next question is from Sumari van Staden. It refers back to a drug that was mentioned earlier, and I'll spell it just to make sure that the pronunciation isn't skewed. The way I say it is PREXUM.
Prexum.
Prexum plus.
Yeah, Prexum is an ACE, so it's an angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitor. It's a very good drug. You get it either on its own or you get it with a diuretic. We are less and less inclined to add diuretics for several reasons. One, because they haven't seemed to to prolong life, if you want to put it bluntly, as an antihypertensive, for one. And secondly, there is the dilemma of actually losing micronutrients and minerals because of the extra diuresis, which can become significant. Whenever you have a co-something or something plus, it has a diuretic with it. There is a place for it, but one needs to be aware that whenever you have a co or a plus, there is a loss of minerals, particularly potassium and magnesium, and both of those can cause quite a number of problems, cramps, and intolerance to stress, and a number of other things which are also potentially harmful. But Prexum is a well-known ACE inhibitor, and it is certainly a drug that one could use if you don't cough.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you for that. So a question from Alex. He says, I see there was some new study around acetaminophen. I don't know if that, okay, leading to reduction in risk perception. Does this change its suitability for technical divers to use?
Yeah, acetaminophen or paracetamol in South Africa, it's essentially the same drug. It's just in America, it's called the one. In South Africa and Europe, it's called the other. Is an interesting drug because it's actually been shown to lower the let's call it the discomfort of social phobia. In other words, what has been realized is that the pain or the discomfort of social phobia actually is similar to physical pain. And as a result, there is definitely an effect. Whether the effect is sufficient that it would actually cause one to make poor decisions has not been proven, and acetaminophen or paracetamol has been used quite extensively. With technical diving in general, I would be far more rigorous about both the reasons for and the safety of whatever medication an individual would use. and it would certainly not be on a record-breaking dive that you would like to try it on for the first time. So one should weigh up those risks, but the same can be said for some of the antidepressants. Many of the so-called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or selective serotonin and norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, also have as a side effect a tendency to be less self-critical. And that's a good thing if you're depressed, because you know, the thoughts of running yourself down is one of the features of depression. So a drug that alleviates that is a good thing. The downside is that it may make you a little bit less vigilant on warning signs or your gauges or alarms or that sort of thing. In reality, many SSRIs and SNRIs have actually now been approved for aviation, basically for the reason that an untreated depression is more hazardous than well-treated depression. But bear in mind that there are side effects, and one needs to be cognizant of those side effects. And perhaps here, something I'd like to bring in is the issue of social responsibility. When you are diving with another diver, because we're buddy diving is sort of still the benchmark, if you like, for diving, one should be willing to make the other person aware of whatever liabilities or physical disabilities or medications you're on, if it would affect your ability to meet your social responsibility to them. Because they're relying on you, you shouldn't only be relying on them. And if you are on a medication like this that might make you less aware than you could otherwise be, it would be wise to structure your dive and the people you dive with that would be able to look out for you and would be able to maybe not compensate so much, but just be aware that that would be something to look out for. To just make sure, are you aware of what your gauge is saying?
All right. Well, thank you for that. Another question via Facebook. What are your thoughts on boric acid for ears?
It's been used. It like many other drugs or medications, Domeboro, which is an astringent, and so on. They are constituent parts of a number of solutions that have been used for swimmer's ear. The success is quite variable, and it depends to a large extent on when you start. If you start once the ear canal is largely shut, because it swells shut quite quickly, then it is quite difficult to actually get enough of that irrigation and antiseptic effect for it to not only eradicate the infection, but bring down the inflammation. And for that reason, one resorts to systemic antibiotics and cortisone fairly quickly with swimmer's ear because of that swelling component. But it is, and it has been part or one of the constituent parts of some of the ear irrigation solutions. So the answer is it can be used, not full strength, but as a constituent part.
Okay, fantastic. So last question of the evening, it goes something like this. Can we consider alcohol as a drug? And if so, what are the effects of it when diving? I feel there might be a question behind the question, but...
Yes. Well, the big question, I shouldn't have done that. I broke my slide. There we go. Back to that. Let me take you back to my second slide, which was, what is a drug? Okay, a drug is anything you take that makes you behave or act differently. So is alcohol a drug? Yes, of course it is. Of course it is. It's just a socially acceptable one, but one needs to be responsible.
Yeah.
I will tell you one sobering thing, and that is, and pun intended there, there was a high court case of an airline transport pilot who flew after drinking a significant amount of alcohol, and when tested for the blood alcohol level, their blood alcohol level was down to 0, but they were still hungover. They'd had a bad night's sleep, they were dehydrated, they couldn't concentrate, they had a headache, and so the court ruling was that they were still diving under the influence of alcohol. And so it's not just the drug, but it's also the aftermath of having had alcohol or having been subjected to a drug or medication that one needs to consider, not only while you're taking the drug, but also afterwards. Okay, so hope I answered that question. Good question. Thanks for that.
Anyways, great questions all around, I'd say. That brings us to the end of the questions. I think maybe it's time just to address the lucky draw winners. You know, it's always nice to hand out a few things and just say thanks to everybody. For now, while I try to just get my ducks in a row, I'm going to use my random online name picker. Just give me a second to get that sorted. And let me see if that's going to work. All right, I've got 3 winners. So each of you will receive one of the Dan buffs, just to say thank you. Hopefully for the folks that join in the future, you'll also be one of the lucky draw winners. But this evening, the first winner is Carol Moore, Amishan Naidu, and Ian Robertson. So well done and congratulations. I'll be in touch with you tomorrow and I'll make arrangements to get those Dan buffs to you. Yeah, I guess just thank you once again. Great webinar, and it looks like you know, we had folks stick around from the start till the end, so that's always good to know. As usual, you know, I'll send the follow-up email tomorrow, and there'll be a range of Dan resources in there. Obviously the replay, I'll add some of the articles I mentioned, and I'll also add the some of our reference guides on health and diving for you to consider, along with some of the online courses we have for you to log in for free and view some of the content that we have available via the Dan e-learning platform. Now, I just received a shout out from one of the attendees. His name's Tom Cross. He's from Centurion or Tshwane, Pretoria side. And he asked me if I could just make an announcement for the folks that make use of the De Jong swimming pool for scuba training. And there seems to be quite a lot of people that are making use of it, or different sporting disciplines. And they're just trying to get that sorted. And what they've asked is people from these different disciplines, including scuba, to attend a meeting at the swimming pool at 9 a.m. So it'd be great if you can support that. If you'd like to know more about that, you can give me just drop me a mail or a message, and I'll put you in touch with Tom, and he can tell you more about that. But for the moment, I'd just like to say I think that's all for the evening. It's great to have you folks on board. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, you can reach out to us via the Dan hotline, and the Dan hotline number is +27 828 10 60 10 within the Dan Southern Africa region, or you can email the Dan Medics on danmedic@dansa.org. And for those of you that are Dan members that have renewed, joined recently, and have been members for years, thank you so much. We appreciate your support. It's your membership fees that not only provide the necessary membership benefits in an emergency, but also help us with initiatives like these, research, and so much more. So thank you for that. For those that haven't joined Dan or haven't renewed yet, you know how to get hold of us. And if you don't, the best place to find all the information required is on the Dan website, and that's easy to find. It's www.dansa.org. So that's it from my side. Dr. Cronje, any parting words from your end?
Well, Morne, just thank you again for arranging these webinars. It's really a wonderful way to interact virtually with our members. And we really hope that this adds value. And the dialogue is so invaluable in establishing this culture of safety, culture of caring for one another, and just being generally aware. So I'm very excited about it, and thank you very much for having me.
It's always a pleasure. And maybe just some parting thoughts from my side. We've got some more webinars lined up for November and early December. At the end of this month, we'll have Dr. Maroney from Dan Europe. He's the founder there and president and CEO, and he'll be talking about the heart in diving and the aging diver. So quite a relevant topic nowadays, and some studies that they've done on that. And I'll also have Frauke from the Dan America office, and she's going to be talking about some of the research studies they've been doing and started up on the COVID concerns. So that'll be quite interesting. That one in particular will most probably be over a weekend, just due to our work schedule and things like that. But keep a lookout for those. And we've also got one more lined up early December with you, Dr. Frans Cronje. So closer to the time, I will start promoting those. From my side, thank you very much. It's been a great evening. Good night, and see you next time.